you want to begin or is we go start to go through?
I'll just be quick. I'll just do the table of contents and then I'll just defer.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because you really handle that section.
Yeah. You good to go? Folks? Think about what I'm seeing here. Okay. One second. Give me the signal when we begin. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the seminar or the Colloquium series of the program on education policy and governance here at the Kennedy School. I'm Paul Peterson. I'm the director of the program on education policy and governance. And we have a series of events. Next Tuesday, we are going to have Daniel Weisberg from the New York City school system. He's the first deputy chancellor, so the number 2 person in the New York City school system, the largest school system in the United States. So I'm sure many of you will want to join us for that occasion. And then we have a Michelle Rhee coming the following week. So we have she's was the chancellor of the school system in Washington, D.C. at the time that major changes were underway at that point. So we have a number of really outstanding speakers this term. But today we are especially fortunate because we have 2 people who have worked on the same issue from very different vantage points. The Seattle Supreme Court case and its implications for school diversity. They're gonna do a team tag here, going back and forth between them, which is gonna make it all the more interesting. So let me introduce each of them, and then I'll turn it over to them to move the conversation forward. Thiru Vignarajah is the former Deputy Attorney General for the state of Maryland. He is also a person who clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer on the United States Supreme Court at the very time that the Seattle desegregation case came before the Supreme Court, and therefore knows exactly how that issue unfolded inside those closed doors in that temple that we have in Washington, D.C. That is so hard to access unless you're one of the very privileged few. So we're just very excited to have Thiru Vignarajah here. He's currently at a prominent law firm in Baltimore, Maryland. He teaches courses at Johns Hopkins, and he's had a distinguished career in many other respects, including running for the mayor of Baltimore. So maybe that will be something he will build upon in the future. We never know. So thank you very much for joining us. And the other speaker we have today is Joseph Olchefske, who is currently an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Education there. And he's especially relevant to our discussion today because he was the superintendent at the Seattle Public School System, which was at the time that this topic emerged as a significant legal issue. He currently does a lot of work in the how to do student weighted budgeting, and that's very much based on the experiences that he had in Seattle. And so we are very grateful that the former superintendent of the Seattle Public School System, Joseph Olchefske, is also with us. So Joseph, you're gonna open it up?
Yeah. I'm just gonna talk for a moment just to set the context for what we're gonna talk about today. It's really great to be here with you. Thiru and I did a somewhat similar presentation a year ago, so it's great to be back for a reprise of that. And
Oops.
Well, one second.
That did not work.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
Okay, let's see. There we are.
Paul has already done the welcome and introduction, so we've accomplished one major task today. Thiru is going to talk about, set some historic context on Supreme Court cases as they relate to school desegregation that ultimately were what I inherited, Seattle Public Schools inherited in the late 1990s as we thought about a diversity plan. Okay, then I'm going to sort of go under the covers of Seattle Public Schools from as we developed that plan, what our objectives were beyond sort of the high principles of the Supreme Court cases. How do you as a school district superintendent implement that in real time, in real ways with real students? So I'll get a fair amount of detail about that. And then Thiru is going to, which ultimately resulted in us being sued and ultimately resulted in us getting to Thiru and Justice Breyer and the Supreme Court. And so he'll talk about that, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Maybe you want to do it. You're fine. Okay. Okay.
One more slide.
There you go.
And I just want to keep this slide up for just a moment, because the reality is that the worst kept secret in this country is that America's public schools remain stubbornly segregated by race. In fact, we are today more segregated in our public schools than we have been at any point since 1968. And the underlying reality is explained by a number of factors. White flight from our urban centers, demographic changes across the nation, the rise and fall of private schools. But one of the most significant factors that does not get enough attention is the pivotal decisive role of the US Supreme Court in defining these chapters where we have gotten better and worse as a nation when it comes to the level of segregation in our public schools. Everybody knows that before 1954, before Brown versus Board of Education, segregation by law, de jure segregation, was permitted, and school districts across the nation took full advantage of that and kept races apart in the school system. 1954's decision, a unanimous pronouncement by the Supreme Court in one of the most momentous, pivotal decisions in all of Supreme Court history, was supposed to change that. But we know all too well that it did not. In the immediate aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, you saw a period, and I think we can take the slide down, you saw a period of non-compliance across the country. School districts, particularly in the South, openly defied the Supreme Court's pronouncement in Brown. The most dramatic, most well-known example of this gave rise to a Supreme Court decision called Cooper versus Aaron that came from Little Rock, Arkansas. Governor Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, was so committed to keeping public schools segregated that he ordered the state militia to block the schoolhouse doors of Little Rock Central High School to stop Black children from entering that school. It required an act of the president, President Eisenhower, who federalized the state militia and sent in the 101st Airborne Division to desegregate Little Rock Central High School. Paratroopers took those 9 kids by hand into that high school. And the Supreme Court not only reaffirmed its commitment to Brown versus Board of Education, but in subsequent cases made it the law of the land. They allowed the mandates that became examples that were used in districts across the nation to make sure that integration was not just a matter of principle, but a matter of practice. And that continued for a number of years until demographic changes and the Supreme Court intersected once again. In the immediate wake of the 1968 decisions from late 60s to early 70s, you saw white flight across the country, where white parents and their families moved out to the suburbs. And that caused a confounding problem that gave rise to a most important case, Milliken versus Bradley, which went to the US Supreme Court in 1974. In 74, the Supreme Court had changed itself. Justice Thurgood Marshall, who of course had argued Brown versus Board of Education and had been the great champion of the integration cases up until that year, now was in the minority. 2 new Supreme Court justices had arrived at the court thanks to President Richard Nixon. And as a result, Justice Marshall found himself in dissent in Milliken versus Bradley. Milliken versus Bradley confronted the problem of what you do in the city of Detroit when so many white families have left for the suburbs that you cannot deliver integrated schools because there are no more white children left in the inner city. The federal court in Detroit said that the answer was to require cross-district busing, that white children from the suburbs would be bused into the city and Black children from the city would be bused to the county to deliver on the promise of Brown. That was the law of the federal district court, and it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a surprise reversal, Justice Marshall found himself in dissent. It was the Supreme Court that said, we can't do anything about that problem in Detroit, even though the state of Michigan has contributed to this problem. The city of Detroit can't solve it by having cross-district busing. Justice Marshall, in that decision, famously and tragically wrote, if our children do not learn together, I fear there is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together. That was the beginning of the end. In a series of decisions by the late 80s and early 90s, the Supreme Court pulled back even further. And the high watermark in this country was 1988. That was when America's public schools were more integrated than ever before. But the Supreme Court delivered, after Milliken versus Bradley, a number of blows to efforts, and it empowered the Office of Civil Rights under Ronald Reagan, the very same office that had fought for integrated schools in the decades before, to march into one federal court after another and say, we've come far enough. We've achieved unitary status. We don't need these federal decrees and these federal consent orders anymore. We can step back. And from 1988, in the years that followed, our schools became more and more segregated again. They resegregated. And by the time that we reach the years that Seattle is confronting this problem, America's public schools have become profoundly resegregated. This was the problem, and this was the law that Joseph and his team inherited when they tried to fight this problem that was happening not only in Seattle, but across the nation.
Great. Thank you, Thiru. And if you could put the slides up, Michael.
Second.
Great. So a little context about me. I joined the Seattle Schools in 1995 as the Chief Financial Officer of the Seattle Schools. The Student Assignment Department reported to me. The district had hired the first of the non-traditional superintendents, retired General Black Republican in liberal white Seattle. And I was originally CFO and then became deputy superintendent. And our charge was clearly to make significant change within the district. As CFO supervising the student assignment plan, I took the lead and was a lead author of our new student assignment plan. And then the superintendent passed away in office and I became superintendent and served for 5 years. So I can go forward here. Okay, let me give you a quick synopsis of the demography of Seattle Public Schools. Here's Puget Sound, here's a big lake, right? Here's downtown. And the school district is coterminous with the city of Seattle. Demography-wise, the geography of the city can be divided into 3 broad sections. The north end of the city, rich-er, white-er, fewer immigrants, and excess school capacity, meaning there is more seats in the schools available than there are kids residential in that area. Okay, now let me give you a note about race in Seattle. It's true today, it was true 30 years ago. It really isn't divided in the way I think some of the cases that Thiru has talked about, this black-white divide. It's very much a polyglot city. very wide variety of races, cultures in the city. The school district, when I was there, was about 40% white, 25% Black, 25% Asian, 10% Latino, and a meaningful 3 or 4% Native American. So we inherit this world of desegregation cases that define the world as black and white, when in fact, that really doesn't apply in a Seattle environment, but we were driven to comply with that. So what I'll be talking about today is a white population and a non-white population, a white population and a minority, white and kids of color. Those to me are all synonymous with this premise, which was driven absolutely by deseg law. So richer, whiter, the South is the mirror image of that. Poorer, more people of color, more kids of color, more immigrants, and deficit school capacity, meaning there are more kids resident in those neighborhoods than there are seats in the schools available. And then this area in the West, which is in many ways could have been a district unto itself, very balanced, mixed income. There, the divide runs east-west. If you were on the west side of the hill, you got the great views, so rich people live there. If you were on the east side of the hill, you looked over an industrial area, so that was lower income. But it was moderate immigrant population, about a right-sized school capacity. Okay, this is the plan that we inherited. I inherited when I came in 1995 with Superintendent Stanford. We had had 20 years of a desegregation plan, and we called it a desegregation plan. It was known as a desegregation plan, absolutely driven by everything Thiru said. And the idea was, the premise was we were going to move the kids of color, low income kids of color, immigrant kids from the south end of the city to the north end of the city to integrate those schools. And we were going to magically get the white kids and send them to the south end of the schools to help, to the south end of the district to integrate those schools. Okay, that was the plan in essence. I've described it as we were pretty good at half that plan. We were really good at moving the kids of color from the south to the north. And tens of thousands of kids went that direction. We're really bad at moving the white kids from the north to the south. Parents found workarounds. Parents checked different boxes on the applications. They described their residence differently. For every 10 kids of color we bused north, we moved one white kid south. So it's no exaggeration to say the desegregation plan was built on the backs of kids of color taking hour to hour and a half bus rides each way for 13 years of education. That was a deseg. Oops. There we go. All right. So the plan we created, we viewed it in two contexts. First, as a choice plan. We were, and Professor Peterson has certainly done a lot of research in this area around choice plans. We wanted to take advantage of the dynamics of choice. People being able to choose the school they want. We also, though, wanted to reinforce the principles of diversity, which we think were important to us as a school system, but also important to the community of Seattle, given this polyglot nature of our student population. So any student could choose any school. That was sort of a radical premise when you were arriving from this mandatory assignment. And I'll talk about in a moment assisting in the tiebreakers, because invariably when you have a choice plan, parents don't choose neatly based on the available seats at a school. So invariably there were some schools that got more choice than the seats available. And you had to have a tiebreaker to figure out which kids got the seats and which kids didn't get the seats. We didn't do this in isolation. We knew very well as soon as we did a choice plan, the kids that previously from the south end, we were having take the long bus rides to the north end. We knew they were increasingly going to choose schools closer to home. We didn't know which schools, but we knew generally no one was satisfied with the existing mandatory assignment plan. So we knew they were going to move closer to home, and we knew that was going to change the demographic profile of every school in the district. It also was going to change the academic profile of every school in the district. So higher concentrations of poverty in some schools, higher concentrations of special ed students in other schools, higher populations of ESL, non-English speaking students in other schools. We needed to prepare for that. So schools were competing for enrollment. Remember, we had about 15% excess capacity as a district. So if your school didn't attract kids, we could close you. We created weighted student formula. Money follows kids. So as a student chose, money would follow them to the school of their choice. Historically, districts all over America still today, staff according to provide resources based on a staffing allocation. Every school gets a principal, every school gets a librarian, every school gets a secretary, every 28 kids gets a teacher. And we said, that presumes every kid's the same and every school's the same. And we knew in this choice plan that was no longer going to be the case. So weighted student formula, money follows students. Money is denominated in dollars, not staff. And the amount of money is weighted based on demographic indicators of academic need. So we had $2,500 students in the school, in the district. We had $25,000 students in the district. And depending on which school they chose, got that money. Okay, and it also provided significant school-based control of budgetary decisions. And then finally, we knew key to success is having good teachers and good principals in every school. We changed our teacher contract to allow any school to hire any teacher. Previously, we had a union contract that gave bumping rights. So if there was an opening in a school, whoever was the most senior teacher got the job, regardless of whether they were a good fit for that school or not. We went to no, two-way marketplace. School interviews the principal and the teacher gets to go and select what school they want. And then something that was very important to me was moving our best principals to our highest need schools. Previously, you got a Lifetime Achievement Award if you were a good principal being sent to an easy school. And we said, that's a bad idea. Let's send our best principals to our highest need schools and send our rookies to our lower need schools. And I had the authority as superintendent to make those assignments. So what was the impact of this swirl of market-based reforms? Well, depends on which part of the city you're in. On the north side, I call it the politics of scarcity. Scarcity of kids, right? These schools were artificially inflated in enrollment because we were busing kids from the south end up to the north end. All of a sudden, those kids weren't there anymore. These schools emptied out. Scarcity of resources, yeah.
A quick clarifying question, with this new market-based reform, was there still the tiebreaker system if there was over enrollment?
Yeah, I'm about to get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a critical part of this. Scarcity of resources, right? Because the kids that were leaving the north end were our higher need kids, so they were taking disproportionate money with them. Right, so my daughter was up here. She was a $2,500 kid. The $8,000 kid left her school and went down here. So scarcity of kids, scarcity of resources, scarcity of need. The south end was sort of a mirror image of that, the politics of abundance. Abundance of kids. These schools were artificially depopulated, right? There would be empty seats. And that a kid across the street couldn't get into that school because he had to be mandatorily assigned to the north end to help integrate the north end schools. Now we were giving access. If there was an open seat, you could have it. So abundance of kids, abundance of resources, and abundance of student need. We saw student teacher ratios here, 17-1, 18-1. 25-1, 27-1 on the north side. I could defend that as a superintendent as being academically viable and valid to acknowledge the differential in student need among those two populations. And the West, given the balance it's always had, I call it the politics of continuous improvement. This was not a disruptive moment for them. It was hugely disruptive along this north-south axis. Okay, you had your question about tiebreakers. So you have, and I'll give you a real case. We had a middle school that had 300 seats available for entering sixth grade, right? That's when choice occurs between fifth and sixth grade. 300 seats available, 450 students. Check the box saying that was their first choice. The middle school nearby also had 300 seats available and they had 66 first choices. Okay. They only have 300 seats, 450 kids applied. I have to say no to someone, right? It is a fundamental function of a school district. What kids get in, and then you have to reassign the others. In a mandatory assignment model, you're really unaware of where dissatisfaction is, but it was pretty apparent here. So yeah, I had to send 150 students to a school that none of them had chosen. Tough decision, right? So which ones though? Which 300 get in and which 450 don't get in? Only as this district can make that decision. You have to have a policy, a procedure, an algorithm, a methodology to make that. Here's what we have. We created tiebreakers. Okay, any kid can choose any school. If the first kids that get in are siblings of existing kids in a school. If you live in the neighborhood, you got in next. If you help diversify the school, you got in next. And then finally, distance away from the school. Okay, so let's just apply this. This is a student assignment map. For those of you that are going to go work for a school system, you're going to have one of these. Right? So right there is Laurelhurst, famous because Bill Gates went to that elementary school. Every line on this map is the catchment area for an elementary school. Okay, 5-year-olds pick schools. There's 50 seats for 2 kindergarten classes at Laurelhurst Elementary, and 80 kids want them. Right? Which of those 80 get the seats? Which 30 of them aren't going to get the seats? First step is your sibling go to that school. Okay, you get, let's say that's 20 of them. Okay, that takes away 20 of those 50 seats. The next round is, do you live in the neighborhood? Do you live right here? Okay, that could be another 20 seats. So now you've taken up 40 of the 50 seats that are available. And you still have 40 more kids that want to go there. So then we said, if it's a white dominated school, kids of color got in next. If it's a minority dominated school, white kids got in next. Consistent principle was you're helping diversify the school. Okay, you had to be over 85, I mean, there was a whole bunch of things in the algorithm. But the basic premise, the basic value we are trying to say is we want diverse cultures and diverse communities in the school. And so if you're going to help diversify, we give you preference. You get those 10 seats. Let's say that's 4 kids. Well, there's still 6 seats available. All the remaining kids are white. You would do a concentric circle around this for distance. And the kids that live closer got in next. Okay. Everybody knew that. That was publicly available. That was our algorithm. We could explain it. And we could say our number 1 value is family. So we're going to do siblings. The next value is neighborhood. The third value is diversity. And we've rank ordered it that way. Okay. That worked really well for middle school and elementary school because we had neighborhood. At high school, we went to a pure open choice plan which meant there wasn't neighborhood. So it was high school tiebreakers were siblings first and diversity second. Much bigger impact at the high school level of diversity. So here's the 10 high schools, the 10 comprehensive high schools in Seattle. And, spread around the city. Every year there'd be different choices. And we had to try to accommodate students to get, and we saw a big increase over time of students getting their first choice schools, which was great. The plan was very popular. Then we had a year that there were 4 high schools that the white tiebreaker took effect. Meaning they were white dominated, so minority students got a benefit. Garfield, Roseville, Nathan Hale, Ballard, right there. So remember the rule, all the siblings got in, then the kids that helped diversify the school got in next. So these are white dominated schools. We triggered the tiebreaker. All the kids of color got in next. And then we applied the distance tiebreaker to the remaining applicants, which were all white. And this is how big those concentric circles of distance. Amen. Now I need to say, that school right there, Franklin, was a minority dominated school and white kids got the benefit to get to that school. It was an oversubscribed, popular school, overwhelmingly minority, and white kids got the benefit to get into that school. Not relevant to this case, but from our standpoint, we said, this is not a DSEG plan, this is a promoting diversity plan. Okay, so those were the circles for white students at those 4 high schools. You look at this map, you get this tiny little strip of land here. This is called Magnolia, one of the whitest, richest neighborhoods in the city. And you can see they didn't have access to any one of those 4. In fact, they had to drive by schools in order to get to a school they would be admitted. They'd have to go there, they'd have to go there, they'd have to go there. Right? If they applied here, they would have gotten in. So those are the people who sued us. And they said, were it not for the race-based tiebreaker, what we call the diversity tiebreaker, because it wasn't a race-based tiebreaker, it was a diversity tiebreaker. Were it not for the diversity tiebreaker, they would have gotten into those schools. And therefore the district is involved. So then we get to our friend Thiru here, and it took 5 years for this case. And I'll just say one little detail. I lived right about here. My daughter went to that school. I knew those parents personally. Right? So this was very real to me as a superintendent as well.
And we can turn off the share screen. What Joseph and his team had done was so popular, was so successful, that for a time, it was difficult to find someone who could actually sue. They needed to have standing, and it was impossible to actually bring the lawsuit. 1 second.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry.
It was so successful, so popular, that it was difficult to find someone to sue. But eventually, they formed an organization called Parents Involved in Community Schools, and they brought a lawsuit. At the time,
let me interrupt you, just to give you a data point of how to measure the popularity of it. It's hard to figure out how, a metric to measure this, but school districts do measure birth to kindergarten matriculation, meaning in 1994, X number of kids were born in Seattle. 5 years later, in September of 1999, Y number of kids arrive at Seattle Public Schools in kindergarten. And you can do that ratio. In the 3 years of this, the first 3 years of this plan, we moved the market share of that kindergarten cohort by 8 percentage points.
so popular, successful, resulting in the overwhelming majority of families and students getting their first or second choices, very difficult to challenge. And in fact, At the time the suit was being filed, I very low, because remember that the things that Joseph and his team were now allowing parents to do were things that in previous years, previous decades, previous cases, the Supreme Court had authorized federal courts to order school districts to do. So if you were a segregated school district, we would order you to move kids from one school district to another. Something like that in more modest ways in order to achieve more integrated schools. It didn't cross the mind of so many that that would ever succeed. Chief Justice Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice before Chief Justice Roberts arrived on the court in the years right before this case came, actually authored a unanimous decision involving Seattle where he said, this kind of thing we might make a district do, and that might be controversial. But the notion that a school district might elect to do this, that would never be something that we would stand in the way of until 2007. In 2007, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito joined the court. Justice O'Connor, who had been the swing vote in the Michigan Supreme Court affirmative action cases just a couple years earlier, was no longer on the court. And the majority of the court shifted. In 2007, there were 25 5-4 decisions. And Justice Breyer, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Stevens, and Justice Souter found themselves in dissent in something like 23 of those cases. It was a very difficult year. There was a watershed moment from the court to turn from Justice O'Connor's court and Chief Justice Rehnquist's court to Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts' court. Justice Breyer wrote an impassioned dissent, what Linda Greenhouse of the New York Times described as one of the most impassioned dissents of his career. And at the beginning of the term, we had a sense that this was an incredibly dramatic and important case, but I don't know that I fully appreciated why, or why for Justice Breyer, why it was so important. But then to come to realize that Justice Breyer was the product of an incredible public school in San Francisco, that his father had been the lawyer for the San Francisco School Board, to appreciate that he had grown up knowing that Justice Marshall's caution that if our children did not learn together, that there was little hope of our people ever learning to live together, would be a defining feature of America, that race relations would be tied to whether or not our schools remained as segregated as they were in the 50s and 60s. It was for him a case not about schools, but about the nation and about what direction this nation would go. And he wrote a dissent as impassioned and as long as any of his career, 77 pages. He wrote a dissent where if you look at all of the other dissents of his career, both on the federal appellate court here in Boston, as well as on the US Supreme Court, he ends virtually every single one of them the same. For these reasons, I respectfully dissent. I respectfully dissent for the reasons set forth above. This is the only dissent that he omitted the word respectfully. It was a decision of great consequence for him, for the court, and for the nation. It was hard to fully understand that the generation that Justice Breyer grew up in, who had fought against Brown versus Board of Education, who had had governors send in the state militia to block the schoolhouse doors, had now been replaced by superintendents of schools that were working to make schools more integrated, that we in some respects were starting to deliver on the promise of Brown, not through the Supreme Court, but through the school systems, that parents and school boards and superintendents were fighting for the very objectives that Brown versus Board of Education had promised. And here in 2007, Justice Breyer now found himself in dissent. The very Supreme Court that had authored Brown versus Board of Education would stand in the way of school districts trying to achieve the goals of Brown. I want to share with you two features of the dissent that are a little cerebral, a little academic, that will give you a sense of how pragmatic Justice Breyer wanted the Supreme Court to be. in one feature was the distinction between segregation by law and segregation in fact. For those of you who ever find your way into a law school, you will learn that federal courts for generations were told that if there was segregation by law, a federal court could do any number of things to solve that problem. De jure segregation, segregation that said by law, you have to ride this bus or that bus, you have to go to this school or that school. Federal courts had immense powers to order busing, to order affirmative action, to order solutions to that. But if it was segregation by fact, not by law, but because of residential patterns, but because of where people moved or where people lived, the federal courts were much more restricted in what they could do. Justice Breyer questioned this challenge, this distinction. He challenged the received wisdom that that should make all the difference. And he pointed to Seattle. He said, Seattle is not de jure segregated. It is in fact segregated, but not by law segregated. But there's all sorts of things that the city of Seattle, that the state of Washington had done to create the factual segregation. They drew the lines of where people would go. Housing policies directed where people would move. So to pretend that this was all an artifact of human choice, when actually the city and the state and the federal government put in place the rules that would create these circumstances, he said how strange that that would produce the power of a federal court to remedy the situation. And how strange in Seattle, which was under threat of federal litigation, that is why they lifted these laws. They made the system not segregated by law because they feared lawsuits that could have resulted in the federal orders to do by mandate what Joseph and his team were trying to do by choice. The other distinction that he challenged was this notion that the strictest level of scrutiny was required for discrimination on the basis of race in all cases. He thought it odd that when a system was trying to create more integrated schools, that this same strict level of scrutiny would be applied as though the discrimination that was inherited by the Supreme Court to keep people apart. He thought it odd that you would use the same standard when we were trying to create integrated schools that we would use when we were trying to segregate children by race. But his goal was ultimately to try to leave school systems the choice to do what previous generations had done by force. He wanted to allow school boards to come up and devise solutions to this terrible problem of segregated schools. In 2007, when I was clerking, I recall having to site check to confirm this horrible fact that America's public schools were more segregated by race in 2007 than they had been at any point since 1968. In 1988 was the most integrated America's public schools had ever been. 37% of Black students in 1988 went to predominantly white schools. That number was cut in half in the 20 years following. The number of hyper-segregated schools, schools that were 98 to 100% Black, only 6% of schools were hyper-segregated. That number almost tripled to nearly 20% in the years that followed 1988. In practice, that meant there were 4,000 more public schools that were 98 to 100% Black than there had been in 1988. And so we had to report that America's public schools were more segregated than they had ever been. What was even harder was when Brookings published Justice Breyer's dissent as a reprint 15 years later, and I wrote an introduction to update those statistics. We found that in 2022, things had gotten even worse than they had been in 2007. This nation remains enormously segregated by race. I mentioned to you that Justice Breyer omitted the word respectfully. I want to read to you his last words, echoing Justice Marshall's dissent in Milliken versus Bradley, warning of the consequences for the nation. He wrote, "Finally, what of the hope and promise of Brown? For much of this nation's history, the races remained divided. It was not long ago that people of different races drank from separate fountains, rode on separate buses, and studied in separate schools. In this court's finest hour, Brown versus Board of Education challenged this history and helped to change it. For Brown held out a promise. It was a promise embodied in 3 amendments designed to make citizens of slaves. It was the promise of true racial equality, not as a matter of fine words on paper, but as a matter of everyday life in the nation's cities and schools. It was about the nature of a democracy that must work for all Americans. It sought one law, one nation, one people, not simply as a matter of legal principle, but in terms of how we actually live. Just pages earlier, he explained the difference between what the court had been and what the court was in that day. Yesterday, the plans under review were lawful. Today, they are not. Yesterday, the citizens of this nation could look for guidance to this court's unanimous pronouncements concerning desegregation. Today, they cannot. Yesterday, school boards had available to them a full range of means to combat segregated schools. Today, they do not. He ended his dissent with these cautionary words. The last half century has witnessed great strides toward racial equality, but we have not yet realized the promise of Brown. To invalidate the plans under review is to threaten that promise. The majority's position, I fear, would break it. This is a decision that the court and the nation will come to regret. I must dissent. For a cerebral, thoughtful, measured professor who had served on the Supreme Court and believed in this institution that was supposed to be above the tumult of politics, it was heartbreaking to see a president appoint 2 Supreme Court justices and to change the law so dramatically, so quickly. It was the same thing that Justice Marshall saw when President Nixon appointed 2 justices and flipped the court in 1974 and interrupted the progress that was being seen across the nation. It is a hard problem. It is a problem that we struggle with today. In Baltimore, there are 38 public high schools. 34 of them are 90 to 100% Black. Frederick Douglass High School is where Thurgood Marshall went to high school before he went to Lincoln University and Howard Law School, before he argued before the US Supreme Court the case that set forth this promise of Brown. Frederick Douglass High School in 2024 is 99% Black. That is heartbreaking to say out loud. And as much as I think Justice Marshall would be proud that we are having these conversations, that we are making these commitments in the hallowed halls of Harvard, I think he would turn over to know that in so many ways, the progress he worked so hard to achieve has been reversed in so many ways in so many places all across this nation. Thank you guys so much, and we'll now open it up to some questions.
Thank you, Thiru, and thank you, Joseph. I have questions, but I'm gonna let those of you in the room, I'm sure some of you have questions. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. My name's Sadie. I'm a 2nd-year MBA student. I was in Professor Peterson's class last fall, and y'all's presentation then was definitely one of the most impactful for me personally, and has stuck with me a lot since. And I was just curious if there was any data from the last year as you continue to sort of assess the impact of this reversal on Seattle as a school district. I know you talked a lot about how kind of like overnight the schools became much less diverse. I was curious if you've also been looking at student outcomes and anything like that as a result of that Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, I think the impact of the Supreme Court case isn't measured in months or a year or 2. I mean, it's a decade-long transition because, as we saw with Brown versus Board of Ed, I mean, there are those that ignore and those that move. So I don't think there's anything new in that sense, but I think we can certainly say the forces that have been driving the use of choice-based methods to improve equity, to improve diversity, yeah, are limited now.
I'll just add, solution in Seattle was that it married the arguably conservative school choice movement with the arguably liberal diversity mandate, right? It brought those two things together. It's one of the reasons it became workable. Those are the kinds of practical political solutions that I think are going to be needed to wrestle with a problem that is so practical and political. I continue to hold out hope because of things that are well beyond our control. The demographics of the nation are changing. We are becoming more diverse as a nation for any number of reasons, and that itself will cause some measure of diversity to trickle into the school system. But the rise of private schools will counteract that as more people leave increasingly diverse public schools for private schools because they fear it. But I think the greatest reason for optimism is that because of increased mobility, you will see families of all different backgrounds move to where there are great schools. The exodus of the population in Baltimore is not the white flight of the 50s and 60s and 70s. It is Black flight. We lose a percentage of our population in Baltimore every year for the last 10, 15 years. And overwhelmingly, that is Black families that have moved to the suburbs for better schools and less crime.
And that's not unique to Baltimore.
And that is not
right?
unique to Baltimore.
There are lots of data points
And-
around America to support that observation.
And so, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, the arc of history is long, but it does bend toward justice. You think that there is some reasons, but unfortunately, the Supreme Court that was once the sponsor of that progress is now one of the obstacles.
No, go ahead.
So, the promise of Brown. And when I look at Brown, I think it was implemented, and I'm gonna say this humbly, incorrectly. They took children of African-American children and supposedly integrated white hemispheres. However, I've done a fair amount of interviewing of students who are my age who went through school deseg in the South. In the city of Raleigh, they used one child to integrate the entire city. When my cousin told me that, at first I said, "You mean one in every school?" Which to me would have been cruel and unusual. But she said, no, it was one in the entire city. Then you had the Southern Manifesto. And I found a very interesting memo from Justice Powell. And in that, everybody should look at this memo, because in the memo, he describes exactly what should happen to take away power from somebody like me. So what he was looking at, and he wrote it to the Chamber of Commerce, because that's your money sector. And he was trying to figure out, how do we keep the money? And he came from Southern Tobacco. So I share that because I don't know if what's happening today is a mistake. I think in many ways it's deliberate, that we were going for the right thing. We have to say in America that integration is the way to go, because they're not going to give me a separate nation. So you have to say integration is the way that it should go. However, if we keep singing that same song of integration is the only way that we can go, we're never going to equalize neighborhood schools. So I'm from Boston, and I look at 25 neighborhood schools that I can look at. They call them transformative schools. They are not transformative.
Okay, so now I'm gonna have
Oh,
to ask you to ask the question.
So the question is the promise of Brown realistic today? Do we need to look at it very seriously to figure out what do we do in the next 10 years? And at what point do we make that sort of information public?
So as I hear it, the question is,
Mhm.
can you improve the schools without achieving the integration that Brown promised? Yeah.
Well, I think we have to start, I'd make two observations about Brown. Number one, it creates a blunt instrument. Divides the world into black, white, and you measure desegregation, integration, segregation by counting noses. And second, it assumes a racial composition of America different than the composition we have today. Seattle has the rise of biracialism that exists. What box do you check if you were a biracial student? The polyglot nature of Seattle or Oakland or Los Angeles or lots of cities, Minneapolis, across America. So I certainly, if you say, if the promise of Brown was driven by a racial reality of 1955 and gave the world a blunt instrument, I think we do need to acknowledge the nature of race in America is different in 2024. It's a broader palette, and thinking through instruments that can acknowledge that. This is why I'll stop by just saying, I think the issue here is diversity. I think it's cultural diversity. Race is a good indicator of that, but it's a big world today.
If I take the question to be, is the promise of Brown as it was originally conceived still a worthy goal? My answer is I sure hope so. Because the notion as a practical matter, and I think that's how I take your question, that we could pretend that all Black schools in America today, those hyper-segregated schools that I said there were 4,000 more of, are achieving better than the integrated schools is just not true. The 4 schools out of the 38 high schools in Baltimore that I mentioned that are meaningfully integrated are also the highest performing schools. And the 34 schools, half of which are 99 to 100% Black, are also the schools that have the highest dropout rates, the highest degrees of violence. On every indicator, the most racially segregated schools, particularly all Black schools, are the ones that struggle. So if suddenly we could inject them with a magical formula, maybe that would be a more difficult practical question. But I do think that there's a point that needs to be emphasized in your question about where the burden was felt. It was not felt evenly. Joseph pointed out how many kids from the north were shipped to the south versus the other direction. There's a graphic from Louisville, Kentucky, in Justice Breyer's opinion, where if your letter begins with the following letters, your last name begins with A, E, F, or Q, white children would be bused in grades 11 or 12. Black children would be bused in grades 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. It was one of those things where it was so conspicuous that the burden would fall on Black children. We can't pretend that it was evenly distributed, even at the greatest moment of the promise. It certainly isn't evenly distributed today.
Yes.
It seems like from my understanding that a large force behind the suing from that neighborhood in Seattle was brought on by the fact that neighborhood was no longer in that list of
For high
decision
schools,
making
yes.
for high schools. So might be a very naive question, but what are the possibilities of building a high school in every neighborhood the way there are elementary and middle schools in Seattle, and then adding neighborhood back into the formula? Do you think that would
Can you put the slides up?
do you think that would be
Yeah, we tried a lot of ways. I mean, like any good superintendent would. I mean, when you confront challenges like this, you try on the edge. Yeah. The principal of that school right there, right? Very popular high school. I said, gee, can you let in 25 more kids into your 9th grade class? Great. That moves this line 1/8 of a mile or 1/4 of a mile. Good, but fewer people are ticked off at us, right? There's lots of ways you can sort of find to manage your way through it, but ultimately you get to,
But could you put a high school in every elementary school
well,
district?
so what I did, let me tell you what I did. If you notice this geography, there's schools here and there's schools here, so big gap in between with no school capacity. The reason that exists, we used to have one right here, but we closed it because there's very few kids in this zone. So there was no demand, so we closed all the supply. What I did was open up right there. A small boutique high school. To take pressure off, if you know Seattle, the Seattle Center grounds, I created the center school. And specifically to be able, because I could look at this as an operator, I could look at this map and say, look, in the world of supply and demand, we have a gap here. Let's put a small high school, we couldn't put a comprehensive high school in. So sure, you do lots of things to do it, but ultimately, you have to, if you're confronting the reality that there's 300 seats in the entering ninth grade class and 500 kids want them, you're gonna have to say no to somebody.
And I would just add, there's probably a dozen strategies that you can use to ameliorate the problem, right? School siting decisions is one of them, but that gets made every 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I don't know that a lot of us love the idea that because 9 parents in Magnolia complained that they get a high school plopped in the middle of their backyard in the most affluent. So, but even if we did that, it would only solve for a nation a small factor of the problem. I think whenever you're thinking about these problems, don't think about a particular community. Think about the wide range of cities and suburbs that have a very different set of problems in each one. The notion that you can solve the problem of segregated schools that are divorced by race, that are differentiated by race, without taking account of race, that's the part I get hung up on. If that is what we are trying to solve, to pretend we can close our eyes, I think Chief Justice Roberts had this slogan that, the best way to stop discriminating by race is to stop discriminating by race. And Justice Breyer's dissent obviously is this, powering work, but there is a line in Justice Stevens that is one of my favorite. He said, in response to the Chief Justice's sloganeering, he said, Chief Justice's sloganeering said, the way to just stop discrimination is to stop discriminating. This sentence reminds me of Anatole France's observation, the majestic equality of the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread. The Chief Justice fails to note that it was only Black school children who were so ordered. Indeed, the history books do not tell stories of white children struggling to attend Black schools. In this way and so many others, the Chief Justice has distorted the history of Brown. That, I think, is the problem, is you've got to take account of race if you're trying to wrestle with the problem of race.
Yes.
Well, thank you for the presentation. My name is Gustavo. I'm a MPP student. I also wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on the perception of the families that were against the solution.
Yeah.
Especially on which suggestions can you come up from all this experience about how to tackle those concerns, like in more like a future perspective. You said that there was like these organizations that were forming against the solution that were like your neighbors.
Yeah.
And you also have all this successful evidence about the solution, increasing enrollment, more diversity. How do you tackle that in the future?
Yeah.
I know it's very complicated, of course. What
Sure,
will be
of
like
course.
your suggestion from this experience?
So, I am completely sympathetic with those 30 families in Magnolia that were confronted with this. I mean, they had a difficulty where a white mom and dad with a white kid who lived next door to a mixed race couple who had a mixed race kid. The kid next door got into a high school, your kid didn't. Literally the next door neighbor. Okay. You have the white couple next door that had adopted the Asian kid 18 years earlier. He got in. Your kid didn't. So, I mean, I can appreciate their concern. I mean, this is not unfounded. In my mind, the solution was always anytime we were when you're managing a choice plan, you have to have quality choices. And so the solution always revolves around improving school quality. So just if I can take 1 second. So when I became superintendent, these 3 high schools were the only high schools that were popular in the city. 80% of the parents wanted their kids to go to those schools. The other 20% wanted to go to the other 7 schools. I said, wow, what a mandate for improving school quality. This school became very popular. That school became very popular. that school became very popular. And we could reduce the number of dissatisfied parents because they saw more good options.
Hey, anybody else? You have a question? Yes.
Hi there, I'm a student here, an MPA student. I was thinking about when you spoke to the future and Black migration into the suburbs. So in your mind, could you see that happening here, maybe in 50 years? Now we have these once amazing schools that are now becoming slowly more decrepit. And do you see a white flight again into private schools? Do you see Black folks like myself getting double taxed in that sense, where now, yes, we've made it, we've gone to the suburbs, but now we're dealing with schools where there's been like another white flight again. So now you're at a precipice where you can't you're not at an equal level again because you're being double taxed.
The short answer is it's such a good intuition, and it's unfortunately being borne out by evidence across the nation. It's important to emphasize Joseph's last point, which is the only real solution to this, which is the dreamland, is that there are so many great schools that are all accessible and or free, that everybody can go to a school that, you know, makes their kid the happiest and most educated they could possibly be. We're a long way from that. And unfortunately, Professor Peterson said this in the car ride over, the one truth that will never change is that a parent cares most about their child. And they're going to do whatever they need to do to make sure their child gets the best education they can. In Baltimore, that Black flight from the city to the suburbs has caused exactly what you're referencing, which is an increasing number of parents moving their kids to private schools and the rise and increase of the number of private schools. It's not necessarily what fueled it in the 50s and 60s, which was genuinely not wanting to go to school with Black children. It is now just being driven by wanting to go to good schools, right? It isn't necessarily as nefarious, but it has the same effect.
Let me add, though, because there's another demographic trend that I think is worth considering. The gentrification we're seeing in cities, and Seattle is a perfect example, as more families with dollars are moving into the city, low income, particularly immigrant populations, are getting pushed out to the suburbs. And previously, what I'll call bedroom community suburbs, code word white suburbs, are now diversifying very rapidly. And I can tell you, because I've coached a number of these superintendents, it is an incredible curveball for them. What are these kids doing here? We don't have an ELL program. We don't know how to do Title I programming for these low income populations. And the in-city schools, the Black population that is staying becomes a very upscale Black population. So there are still room for Black families in those cities. I mean, we see it in Seattle, you see it in DC, is very much the same way. A lot of the low income, highly disadvantaged minority community is getting pushed out to the suburbs. So there is another dynamic sort of at play there.
So we're coming up almost on our limited time. I do have one question,
We knew it
that I
was
want
coming,
to
Paul.
and that is, I think it's 1960 or maybe it's 1970, that 80% of the students in the public school system of the United States was white. Today, it's close to 50%. It's going to be crossing that line very shortly.
Yes.
So, how are you ever going to have Black students going to predominantly white schools if that's what is what it takes?
I mean, I'll start by saying this. I don't know that the goal in 2024 is the same as the goal in 1954. The nation has changed. The demographics have changed. What I don't want to see is a retreat to the days where de jure segregation by law, is replaced by de facto segregation. And I keep using Baltimore as an example because it is the most extreme adverse consequence, right? 34 high schools that are 90 to 100% Black in 2024. And all of those schools have incredibly low performing standards with a few, bright spots. That's a problem. Because the nation is becoming more diverse, I would love to see schools that reflect that diversity, whether it's 20, 30, 40. I mean, the polyglot of Seattle is going to become the polyglot of the nation. That is an opportunity. But if the schools that have the most non-English speakers are also the schools that are struggling the most, we've just replaced one problem with another. And I do think that people will continue to retreat to wherever the best schools are that they can afford, whether it's private schools or the suburbs. Counteracting that, and I'll sort of end by saying this, this is not going to have one silver bullet solution. There is going to need to be a menu of 15 or 20 solutions where schools are cited, charter schools, school choice, diversity mandates, magnet schools. There's going to be a bunch of different things that are on the menu that superintendents of different school districts that are confronting their particular problems have to be able to choose from to try to create great schools for all the kids. That has got to be the solution, which is why each and every one of you needs to be doing a lot of work in the years ahead.
All right. Well, thank you both for a terrific.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.